It's really my great pleasure to have Dr. Carlos Rodriguez join us. He's the Director of Clinical Cardiovascular Research at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. I think you're going to find what he has to share with you empowering and insightful. So, Dr. Rodriguez, thank you so much. Pointer right here.
It's a great pleasure to be here. I have a long history with the Make Well Known Foundation and the Alliance. So it's a beautiful cause. It's a worthy cause. I'm glad to be a part of it. And I'm glad to be speaking with you today. What I'm going to change directions and talk about is focus on cholesterol in the Hispanic population. I'm going to start with a background of Hispanics. Some of the points have been touched upon earlier, but I always put up this slide because we actually wrote a call to action, a scientific advisory on cardiovascular disease in Hispanics and Latinos in 2014. This was published in circulation. It's available online. It's a free document. You can certainly download it, read it, but it was at the time the very first document that was condensing all the information about cardiovascular disease in Hispanics and Latinos in the US, which, as was mentioned before, for Asian Americans with Latinos, there's a lot of heterogeneity and complexity that was unappreciated before. So I encourage everybody to look up this document, and a lot of what I'll say is in this document as well. So the big picture is the overview of the U.S. population and where the Hispanics fall in that. So about 48% of the U.S. population is non-white. A great percentage of that is Latino. This is 17.4%. I think it's now up to 18% or slightly over 18%. So the Hispanic population is a significant proportion of the US population. We're talking about 55 million Hispanics, 55 million Americans that reside in the United States. Why that's significant? It's the single largest ethnic minority. So it's larger than African Americans, Asian Americans, than any other minority. And the 55 million is actually a number that's greater than the population of Canada or Australia. So we're talking about a large number of people. And why is that important? Well, I'm a cardiologist, but I'm also an epidemiologist. And when you talk about public health, numbers are important because the larger the population, or the larger the segment of population, the more public health impact there is. So the message is that we need to know more about the health of the Latino population and how we can treat it, how we can address the health complexity of this population, which I'll talk about. So for starters, with Latinos, it's important to know that there's selective migration of Latinos into the United States. And you can see in this map, it's highlighted. The dark areas are where Latinos are. So Latinos went to certain spots in the United States. There's in the Southwest, the West Coast, the Southeast in Florida, and also the Northeast around New York, New Jersey, Connecticut area. And also a light purple spot around Chicago, Illinois, where there's a large concentration of Hispanics. So what that means in knowing the Hispanic population and treating it is that depending on where you are, you're going to encounter different types of Hispanics. And that is, generally the case. If you are in the West Coast or the Southwest, you may encounter Hispanics of Mexican background. Whereas if you are in the Southeast or in Florida, you may encounter Hispanics of Cuban background or Caribbean background. And the same thing, if you are in the Northeast, you may encounter Hispanics of Dominican background or other Caribbean backgrounds. So it's just important to realize that so that you don't kind of paint a picture of the entire Hispanic population just based on what you see locally, but that you understand kind of more broadly the complexity and heterogeneity across the country and why that is. The other thing about the Latino population is that there's a racial heterogeneity among the Latino population. So being Hispanic is not a race, contrary to what was previously thought. It's an ethnicity. The concept of race is really something that is confusing among Hispanics because the concept of race in the United States is very dichotomized to being white or black. You know, in Latin America, it's a different way of looking at race. That's very confusing to people of Hispanic and Latino background who come here and who are not acculturated to how the U.S. population looks at race. Hispanics are a very admixed population. There's centuries of admixture that has been going on of West African, European, and Amerindian ancestry that's been admixed. So it's different, and you can see this was actually bore out in genetic studies, shown on the figure on your right. What the figure shows is that depending on where you are in Latin America, or where you're from, where your background is from, your genetic ancestry will differ. So Hispanics of Mexican background are predominantly, you can see here, blue and red, so they're predominantly of Amerindian and European ancestry with very little African ancestry, whereas as you go to Hispanics of more Caribbean background or Central American background, you have more of the green color, more African ancestry is seen and less European ancestry. So again, another factor of heterogeneity in the Hispanic population. This slide is meant to show the overall state of cardiovascular health disparities in the United States. And being specific to cardiovascular disparities, this is meant to show that we've had over time progress in reduction of cardiovascular mortality in the United States. And as cardiologists, the American Heart Association, everybody is very proud of that. But the key thing, even though there's been declines across different race ethnic groups in the United States, there is still a large gap in the mortality that we see, the cardiovascular mortality that we see. There's still a lot of health disparity where African Americans still have the highest rates of cardiovascular disease. And the data that's here that's presented for Hispanics is only for Hispanics of Mexican background, which I would argue is probably the healthiest of the Hispanic groups, if you look at it. So we need more representative data on cardiovascular mortality across all Hispanics. Going back to the general epidemiology of the Hispanic population in the United States, Hispanics are generally of low socioeconomic background when compared to non-Hispanic whites. Non-Hispanic whites are shown here in the yellow bars, Hispanics in red bars, and generally Hispanics have a lower median income, more likely to be in poverty, or to be, or less likely to be, have a high school education or a college education than non-Hispanic whites in the United States. And obviously, those types of that type of data can obviously contribute to health disparities as well. Interestingly, the unemployment rate is not too different between Hispanics and non-Hispanic whites, about only a difference of 1%. But despite that, there's a big discrepancy in access to care. And I think it's relevant because a lot of insurance is really obtained, health insurance is really obtained through employers. So Hispanics are twice more likely than non-Hispanic whites in the U.S. to lack health insurance. And even when they do have health insurance, Hispanics are more likely to be underinsured. So, and that's a striking statistics despite similar rates of employment or similar rates of unemployment, which again highlight the low socioeconomic status among Hispanics. And what it all adds up to is that Hispanics are 3 times less likely to have a regular health care provider than non-Hispanic whites in the United States. These slides are meant to show the high risk of diabetes on the left, or on your left over the lifetime. For Hispanics are shown in the red curve. They have the highest risk of lifetime risk of diabetes, developing diabetes. On the right shows that Hispanics have a higher risk of having undiagnosed diabetes or pre-diabetes than non-Hispanic whites in the U.S. And same things hold true for obesity, where Hispanics have a high prevalence of obesity and being overweight compared to non-Hispanic whites. And they're rates that are very similar to what's seen in the African American population. So all of that, for me, blends into cholesterol, which is the main topic of the day. And when we think of cholesterol, I think everybody knows about the top bar, the good, the bad cholesterol. LDL is the bad cholesterol, HDL is the good cholesterol. Triglycerides are up there because they factor in the calculation for total cholesterol. But why is cholesterol important? Cholesterol, you can see by the figure on your right, cholesterol is what builds into the arteries, creates plaque, what we call atherosclerotic plaque, which over time grows and then over time ruptures. And when it ruptures, it forms a clot within the artery that blocks blood flow. And when we're talking about the heart in particular, that is the genesis of a heart attack. Now, the interesting thing is that this develops over time. So you have cholesterol that starts out in the bloodstream, but eventually gets into the vessel wall. And the only way to know is to check your cholesterol, and if it's high, have it lowered, because if it's high, then it's more likely that it'll go into the vessel wall and eventually create this plaque and this blockage. The figure on the left shows all of the different body systems that this cholesterol process can affect. It can obviously cause heart attacks, which I mentioned, but it can also cause strokes, cause blockages in the peripheral arteries, which feed the legs, the feet. So it can contribute to obviously amputations, and can also weaken the aorta, which is the main artery of the body, shown there, kind of ballooning out in the middle. So cholesterol is very important health-wise, and a lot of the things that I described, the diabetes, the hypertension, all as from a cardiologist's point of view, from a cardiovascular point of view, all comes together to contribute synergistically with high cholesterol levels to form this plaque and eventually form the rupture and form the blood clot in the vessels. So obviously, from a health point of view, treating cholesterol and knowing the epidemiology of cholesterol is important. So in the United States, there's millions of adults, 29 million adults that have high cholesterol. But what we've seen over time, and this is the graph on the right, is that over time, the mean cholesterol levels, and we're talking about total cholesterol, not us separating out from the good and the bad. The total cholesterol levels have declined in the United States, going from the 1980s, the late 1980s, to this decade, the 2010s. And why this is because of a greater uptake of statins and cholesterol-lowering medicines. So the advent of cholesterol-lowering medicines have really changed the landscape of high cholesterol in the United States. And that's important. But despite what we see here, there's still disparities when it comes to cholesterol. Just focusing again on the Hispanic population, we see this is data that we published from the study of Latinos, which I'll describe further later. But we can see in this population study of Latinos that a very high percentage of Latinos have some form of dyslipidemia. 65%. That's extremely high. They either have abnormalities in good cholesterol, in the bad cholesterol, the LDL, or the triglycerides, or what we call non-HDL cholesterol, which is a reflection of every cholesterol except obviously the HDL. So Hispanics are still having very high prevalence of lipid abnormalities. And what you see on the left here is also from Seoul, seeing that among those Hispanics that have high cholesterol, only about half were actually aware that they had high cholesterol. So you're talking about half of the population studied not even knowing that they have abnormal lipid levels, and of those that did have high cholesterol, only 30% were receiving treatment, and of those receiving treatment, only about a third were controlled. So you're talking about significant disparities that exist in this population, despite the great advances that have occurred over time. And this is obviously very current data. What is also important to appreciate is that cholesterol varies by race ethnicity. And this is data that when we studied the Northern Manhattan study, which is a population in Washington Heights, Manhattan, that is tri-ethnic. There's African American, Caucasian, and Hispanic population, all living in the same geographic area. And we studied this population and noted that the cholesterol levels differed depending on the race ethnicity. And you can see that reflected here. African Americans actually had lower prevalence of high triglycerides than any other race ethnic group. When it comes to Hispanics actually had similar cholesterol levels to non-Hispanic whites when it comes to the bad cholesterol, or LDL, that I referred to previously. But the difference for the Hispanic population came when you look at either low HDL levels, this is low levels of the good cholesterol, or high levels of triglycerides. Hispanics were more likely than any other race ethnic group to have this pattern of low HDL and high triglycerides. That's a pattern that's known as mixed dyslipidemia. It's a pattern that really portends a poor prognosis despite seemingly similar levels of LDL to non-Hispanic whites. This is another study that saw the same pattern, the same differences in cholesterol level. And what this pattern of mixed dyslipidemia portends and what it corresponds to is actually a smaller and more dense LDL particle. A smaller and more dense LDL particle is more atherogenic. And what I mean by more atherogenic is what I mentioned before about how cholesterol starts out in your bloodstream and eventually gets into the actual wall of the arteries. When the bad cholesterol is smaller and more dense, then it's more atherogenic, more likely to get into the vascular endothelium, into the vascular wall, more likely to get into macrophages and cause inflammation and cause that plaque that we spoke about earlier. So basically what the picture I'm trying to paint is that despite what you would see as similar LDL levels between Hispanics and non-Hispanic whites, the LDL levels don't really tell the whole story because of this high prevalence of a pattern of mixed dyslipidemia, Hispanics may actually have more atherogenic risk than non-Hispanic whites. And we have to look beyond the LDL, the bad cholesterol in the Hispanic population. And what I have here is another cholesterol particle that I think is a better candidate, a good candidate to look at in the Hispanic population, and that's ApoB. ApoB is actually a cholesterol particle that's found in every atherogenic lipoprotein. So it's found in, as you can see in the figure up here, it's found from the bad cholesterol all the way to every size of cholesterol particle, ApoB is found. So when we look at ApoB levels, it may paint a more complete picture that can more accurately reflect atherogenic risk compared in Hispanics compared to just looking at LDL. And studies have shown in other population, mostly European non-Hispanic white populations, that actually ApoB is a more accurate measure of atherosclerotic risk than LDL or bad cholesterol alone, and that ApoB can predict coronary heart disease outcomes independent of LDL. So I think that deserves to be studied more. And then the other candidate that I want to throw out there is LP little a. In the cholesterol world, LP little a has been gaining a lot of traction. It's a novel, emerging, exciting cardiovascular risk factor. What it is actually basically an LDL molecule, a bad cholesterol molecule with ApoB100 wrapped around the outside and then linked to an ApoA component. So I guess you can think of it as a super bad cholesterol. So it's a really bad type of LDL molecule, and it's not captured when we just measure LDL. You have to actually measure specifically LP little a. The thing about LP little a is not only does it possess atherogenic properties where it can go into the vessel wall, cause that plaque, but it also has thrombotic properties, so it stimulates blood clotting. And interestingly, because an LDL molecule is a part of this, remember what I mentioned about small, dense LDL, how it's more atherogenic, how it seems to be more prevalent in the Hispanic population. Well, if the LDL is small and dense, then the LP little a also follows suit and will also be small and dense. So it will also be more atherogenic and even worse than the regular LP little a. So obviously LP little a has been shown to be a risk, an independent predictor of risk for heart attack, stroke, and cardiovascular death. And that's been shown in many studies. This is a study here, I don't know if it's too small for you to read, but with increasing levels of LP little a, and this is among men and women, there were higher rates and higher risk of ischemic heart disease and myocardial infarction. Other studies have shown that if you have high LP little a levels and you also have high LDL levels, together there's an interaction where both of them are worse. There's like an additive effect on your risk for future heart attack. And then there's some data also suggesting that Lp(a) not only can affect the plaque that can develop in the artery wall, but can also stimulate disease in the cardiac valves. In this study, there's a higher risk of aortic stenosis with higher levels of Lp(a). So overall, it's showing that about 1 in 14 heart attacks and 1 in 7 cases of aortic stenosis are probably due to Lp(a) cholesterol. One more slide. 2 more. So SOUL is the study that I think has been mentioned more than once today. And why it's important is because SOUL is the largest epidemiologic study of Hispanic Latinos in the United States. So before SOUL came about, there was no large epidemiologic cohort of Hispanic Latinos in the United States. And SOUL just came about in 2008 is when it started. And it was actually, the first wave was completed in 2011. So we're talking about a very young study, but very important. So for years we had data like Framingham, which is on non-Hispanic whites. We had the Jackson Heart study, which is in African Americans in Mississippi, but we had no data on Hispanics like this. So this is the Hispanic equivalent of those. And there's 16,000 Latinos enrolled in SOUL. It's a study that's across the country in all these sites shown here. Approximately every heterogeneity of Latinos is represented in the SOUL study. So every Latino of different background, different genetic background, different racial background is represented here. And there's a wealth of medical and clinical socio-demographic data shown here that's been collected in this cohort. And as I mentioned, the first wave was completed 2011, so this cohort is being followed through time, so it's ongoing as we speak. So in our collaborative efforts with the Make Well Known Foundation, we plan to study in SOUL the effects of cholesterol in the Hispanic population, in particular Lp(a) and ApoB, as well as more traditional cholesterol factors, which I mentioned, the LDL, the total cholesterol, HDL. And we're gonna see what the relation is between these other markers that I mentioned that take us beyond the bad cholesterol, the ApoBs and the Lp(a)s, and how they relate to traditional lipid measures. We're going to look at the different Hispanic groups and whether there's differences among the groups and the different genetic ancestral components of Hispanics, how that impacts cholesterol levels among the groups, among the Hispanic population. And we'll also look at how this influences cardiovascular outcomes, how this influences actual incident new cases of heart attacks, strokes, angina, coronary revascularizations, heart failure, peripheral vascular disease in the Hispanic population. So we're very excited about this study. Given everything I said, we think it's a very important study and will provide a lot of good data, a lot of important answers that we don't have on the Hispanic population, and we look forward to embarking on this. Thank you.
Thank you.